be. And rather than a specific request or solicitation for contributions today, a few moments that have been allotted to us this morning might be better utilized in attempting to briefly outline some of our goals and objectives, some of our specific financial needs, and perhaps a few of our dreams for a relatively new organization, merely 3 years old, which has grown rapidly to over 180 members. And it represents a groundswell of enthusiasm for what is going on here and what we're planning to do. I personally have felt for many years that one significant test and measure of a community's maturity lies in its ability to transmit its collective experience to the next generation. And all too often the failure to preserve and record the history of a community can lead to its final disappearance. The Bible, as we know, is the recorded history of the Jewish people, and the Torah has sustained our civil throughout the diaspora. Does not the Stanford Jewish community have a history it wishes to pass on to subsequent generations? That goes without question. And can we afford to trust our fading memories and vague recollections to do the total job? When my family first arrived in Stanford, and I'm a newcomer, 15 years ago, typical of many New Yorkers who crossed the Connecticut border, outside of knowing a few couples and the fact that there were 3 temples, a Jewish center, and maybe 8,000 to 10,000 Jews living in the area, there was very little that when we arrived here in Stanford 15 years ago, there was very little that we could focus on that brought this community to life for us. I would have been delighted to delve into its history, learn about its early settlers, understand how it responded to change, what struggles it went through, what it achieved, and its evolution into becoming a significant Jewish community in Fairfield County. In order to feel a sense of community, one needs to know how that community came to be, who were its leaders, what did they accomplish, and what we can learn from them. And so, thinking a little further on the subject of the objectives of the society, I think we arrived at a few fundamentals. Obviously, to preserve, record, document, and research its history, which we've already heard a little bit about this morning. Equally, is to interpret, publish, disseminate these findings, to collect, exhibit its artifacts, to compile and classify this vast array of data available to us, and finally, to enlighten the community and to as a cohesive force in providing an historical perspective both for the newcomer as well as the native Stanfordite. Lofty objectives can be translated into specific needs and requirements. We need a physical space of our own. We need recording equipment of all kinds, microfilm and microfiche equipment if we could ever obtain it, tape recorders and headsets, video monitors and VCRs, tape duplicators, copy machines. These are goals that will take time. We need filing facilities, cabinets, shelves, storage facilities. We need display fixtures. We need a security system to ensure this does not disappear from its premises. And finally, we need the funding for the publishing and printing of newsletters, pamphlets, and the mailing costs to disseminate this information. In short, we need we need funds for a myriad of projects, and if we succeed someday, those who follow will look back with appreciation. For in the final analysis, we are living history, and our story must be told. I promised Irwin that I would not make a solicitation for funds, will not disappoint him. However, I also promised not to refuse any contribution at any time. And anyone interested in helping us achieve some of these objectives will be most welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Bruce. And now we come to the major portion of our program this morning. Ted Gorman will introduce our guest speaker. Ted. Yes.
I'll read it. I don't know how authentic this is, but I did find this source. In 1903, related cornerstone of the first synagogue at Railroad Place, and they claimed it was a very joyous occasion. Even the Christians joined it. They brought cake, they brought fruit, and they came from Hartford and New Haven to join into this joy occasion. Now, the basement and the mikveh was the first thing that was built in Railroad Place. And that in 1907, that's the date I have. And that was at a cost of $5,608.24. And the lot cost $1,200. The first floor was built later. And that was a contract for $4,200. The mason was $3,812. And it was a total $19,620.24. That was the mikveh, the basement, and the first floor. Now, this is what I have, and I hope it's correct.
Thanks very, very much, Greg. That's great. A very important piece of information about the beginnings of this community and the synagogue. Right. As a matter of fact, just to digress for one moment, we've already been called upon by Rabbi Aaron Cranston for us to work with, I believe it's Vivian Feld,
Yes.
concerning the historical celebration due next year on the 100th anniversary of Congregation Agudath Sholom. So this is very important in line with what we'll be asked to do. Now, to get to our program. Ted?
Thank you, Irving. Today will be a continuation of our Jewish family. Wrong hat I had on. That was last Sunday. Jewish Historical Society. And we've been, hopefully every previous month, having an old-timer, old only in length of years in service to the community, speak to us and tell us about Stamford as they remembered it. And we've had some delightful, most informative mornings with people like Morris Brenner is here today. We had Lou Altman. We had Mrs. Gold, who spoke about Mr. Gold. We had Harry Rosenbaum. We worked out Harry Rosenbaum. More to do about that later. We had Herb Liebbaum. We had Herm Allswanger. Each evening, each morning was fascinating to me, and I'm sure to you. Now, last night I happened to be with my wife and I happened to be with a group of. I want to let you know I go out with my wife on Saturdays. With a group of Stamford old-timers, and I said to them, "What is there that you know about our speaker today that no one else knows?" I mean, there's something that I could tell the group today. And surprisingly enough, all they knew was something that was good. And at this little dinner, Lou wants to know all your friends. I found no dirt that I could reveal to the people this morning. However, this morning, and not that it's bad, but we dug into the files only because of my affiliation with Aberth, one of my other hats, and Joe Miller's other hat. And he found in his files a picture taken and an article in 1948 where you chaired a fundraising drive for Hillel. It was a picture of you with Arthur Lillyveld, national director of Hillel at the time. You see, the name sounds familiar to you. It's his son who writes for the New York Times, Arthur Lillyveld. And because of Lou's efforts as chairman, the Stamford B'nai B'rith sought $11,000 towards the building of the Hillel Foundation, and they made $11,000. So, but lately, we want to thank you for it, Lou, and these will go into the files too. It's interesting to look at the names, and also to some other occasion, of the people who are on the committee, but unfortunately, many of them are not here with us today. But the names who really have gone down in history in the Stamford Jewish community. Now, I want to add one other thing. Miriam Goldberg, that you mentioned, and I think Bruce mentioned too, a place to put all the material that you're saving. We have a little hope. Irwin may have told you that I spoke to the mayor's office the other day, and there's a possibility that there will be something available, and we should know shortly, and within range of the Jewish Center. So that let's hope that it turns out that way. Now, today we have a speaker that is basically a pinch hitter. He's a pinch hitter for an outstanding B'nai B'rith member, not B'nai B'rith, forgive me. He belongs to that too. Outstanding member of Jewish Historical Society, Harry Rosenbaum, who couldn't be with us today. Now, a pinch hitter is not someone who just takes someone's place. It's usually somebody who can do a better job than the man who was supposed to be here in the first place. So, this pinch hitter today, when we called him, and my wife called to get a background of what he had done, he refused to list all of the things which would have probably taken hours to enumerate, and just listed a few which you've seen on the card, but I wanted to repeat, because they indicate the diversity of our speaker's activities. Chairman of the Stamford chapter, the American Red Cross, and I've seen action there, and it's a tremendously effective job. He's past president of the Stamford Jewish Community Center, past president of the congregation of Agudath Sholom, past president of Aid for the Retarded of Stanford, past president of Jewish Home for the Elderly, and obviously president, chairman of the board of Hartford Provision and Grand Central Markets, totally indicating an involvement in not only the Jewish community, but every other worthwhile activity in Stanford. I'm honored to introduce to you Lou Lotstein.
Thank you very much. I noted, and good evening and good afternoon, everyone here. I note that this picture that Arnold had, the Harris Real Estate Company. Our family bought the last real estate holdings of the B.T. Harris Company from two of the B.T. Harris girls. There were originally there was three girls, and passed away, and were left with two girls. And these two girls lived in Old Greenwich for a good many years in an attic, and finally they decided to sell their vast real estate holdings. And when we negotiated with them, we really never expected that we would acquire all of them, but we finally did. They were very hard people to do business with, but it's interesting that we did. And we also, they had several people working for them, and one of them still works for us. I see one of our girls here smiling there. So it really brought back memories. The other thing I would like to comment on this is, I never realized that this organization was so well formulated. But in Hartford, I have a daughter-in-law in Hartford who's extremely active in the Historical Society in Hartford. As a matter of fact, she's not only a volunteer, I think she's a paid member there. She works there. She's an office in the Jewish Center there in Hartford. And they've done some tremendous amount of work in bringing up the history of Hartford. See, Hartford, an old-time Jewish population that goes way back, way back. And she kept me acquainted with some of the things they've done. And they do have quarters now in Hartford, and they've done a lot of the things that we're talking about here today, so hopefully you will be able to do the same thing. I noticed some people here in the room, like Mr. Brenner, that certainly knows more, just as much about this history of Stanford as I do, perhaps even more. But I can relate to you things that have happened through three generations that I experienced. The generation of my grandfather, and of course the generation of my father's generation, and my own generation. My grandfather's generation I saw very, not too long. I was a young boy, and Grandpa was a fruit and vegetable peddler. And I can remember very vividly, we used to live on Lower Lafayette Street, and we'd harness up the horse and wagon, and we'd go down, of course, first to the synagogue. And the synagogue, located, as just Mr. Brenner said, down on Gray Rock Place, in the lower level. And I remember very vividly my grandfather hitching up the horse to a stone so he wouldn't run away. And we both went in the synagogue, and it was cold. I remember the winters there was cold. All we had was a little coal stove, but that never ran too very successfully. First thing my grandfather did was to get some schmeck tabak and some brownfin. They had to have some brownfin. As soon as they had the brownfin and the schmeck tabak, we started praying. And after the prayer, we went, my grandfather's route was at the Cove. The Cove Island, all through the Cove Island, mills there. Was all woolen mills up through there. And the people that owned the mills built these homes, all around there were these small houses, very small, and people worked in the mill and they lived in these houses. And my grandfather would come there and he'd peddle his. But of course, he didn't have the fancy fruits that we have today, but he had these staples, the potatoes and onions and things of that type. But people would come out to the wagon and buy them, and then take them back to their homes. And I remember going with him on a number of occasions. And of course, his main object and his main thing in life was our synagogue, which was on Gray Rock Place. As a matter of fact, I was born across the street from the old synagogue on Gray Rock Place. And we happened to be just talking about the other day, my doctor was Dr. Nemoyton. And here a few years ago, on my first trip to Israel, I needed my passport, and I kept delaying the fact that I needed my birth certificate I said, there's no problem. I was born in Stamford. My birth certificate's in the town hall, and I'll get it. But I kept putting it off because I was always busy doing something else. Finally, the last couple of days, I got there, and the girl saw me in the office walking in the town clerk's office. What are you doing here? I said, I'd like to get my birth certificate. She started laughing. I said, what are you laughing about? She says, you're about my age, you were born the same time, and you had the same doctor, and he never recorded anybody. So here I was, ready to go to get a passport, and I had no birth certificate. So I went to the town clerk, George Close. Those of you remember George Close? I said, George, what am I going to do now? Well, he says, where's your mother? Well, mother happened to be in Florida at that time, and he says, you're any of your uncles? I said, yeah, my uncles are here. Were they at your bris? I said, yes. So we brought them in to show that I was properly born, and they got my public school records, and finally I was able to get my passport. But it was interesting that this Dr. Nemoitin never dedicated themselves to going to the town hall, and when he did occasionally, which would be a month or two afterwards, if it was a boy, he made a girl. If it was a girl, he made a boy. He wasn't too fussy about that. And you know, the other thing I relate about Dr. Nemoitin that always interested me, when I first became president of our synagogue in 1952, one of the pressing problems that I was faced with was we had a cemetery that was getting small for use. We had no parking. It was on the main road. Those of you who had occasion to use our original cemetery know the smallness of the area. And we were concerned about the future. What are we going to do? So there was this piece of property, the new piece of property that we use now for the new cemetery. I went to the farmer who owned that property, and I made a deal with him, and I bought the property subject to the fact that we were going to use it for a cemetery. As I was walking out, I noticed a little shack standing outside the gate there, and the farmer says to me, now, Mr. Lotstein, I want you to know that no matter what you do, I don't care after you pay me and I'm out here, don't touch that shack. I said, why? What? He said, I'll come in, I'll show you. He opened up the door, and there was a small shack, a little stove in there, and oil paintings all around. He said, this belongs to Dr. Clayton. He doesn't pay me anything. Comes up here every afternoon, he paints. He has no phone here. He has no way of, nobody knows he's here. He said, I told him he could have it for the use as long as he lived. He was an old doctor of mine, and so I said, don't worry, we won't use this cemetery for some time to come, and we'll observe your understanding with it. And incidentally, when we came to get the use of that property for a cemetery, the neighbors all, Gaynor Brennan, who I don't know if any of you knew Gaynor Brennan, he called me up. He said, Mr. Lotstein, you'll never get that zone for a cemetery as long as I'm living. And he said, you know, I'm going to live for a good many years. So we were concerned about that. And so you will note that what we did, we finally decided what we'll do is they told me that if you annex one cemetery to another cemetery, then there's no problem of zoning. So I went ahead and I got some contractors. The old cemetery, we had a brick wall. I had them break about 10 feet of brick wall and then made an opening. And then we took a lot of pictures. I remember with Arnold, who took the pictures? You remember them? We took pictures showing that it was broken, and we went to the state attorney general, Julius Kuriansky, who would represent us. And the attorney general ruled that this was an annexation of one property to another. And so after we had that ruling, we went back to the zoning board and showed the zoning board there was no need for zoning here. This is once a property. And they finally ruled in our favor, and that's the way that cemetery is today. After we finally got it, we pushed the wall back, so. But we kind of felt very proud about that because it gives Agudath Sholom the rights and privilege of using a cemetery, which is so important for our members and other people for a good many years to come. But anyway, getting back to what we're trying to talk about is the fact that the grandfather passed away not too many years after I was growing up as a boy, as I recall. And my dad was he also was a peddler, more or less, but he was more interested in livestock. And his business traditionally was New Canaan. And I he had an old Ford. In those days, he had an old Ford. It had no sides, and by God, it was cold in the wintertime. And we used to leave Stamford about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning and get to New Canaan about 11:30. It took us about 3.5 hours to get to New Canaan. When we got there, the first my dad would go to was a little diner. There was a diner located in New Canaan. And there, he went to a spindle there, and everybody came in. They had a cow, they had a calf, they had chickens, they had apples. He bought everything. And for a great many years, that was the way we prospered through his peddling of livestock. And the community, of course, started growing. And of course, our area of growth in Stanford, way back, of course, was the area we knew as Pacific Street, Ray Riley's Pacific Street, that whole area. This is where the Jewish butchers were. This is where the delicatessens were. This was the bakery was, stores, and this is actually the business area of the Jewish people in the community. And of course, in a lot of ways, the non-Jewish community really didn't receive us too well. In some ways they did, and in some ways we were restricted. There's plenty of areas today that we can live in Stanford that I can recall as a boy, Jews were not allowed. But today, thankfully, the situation does not exist. But we grew up in that kind of an atmosphere, that this was the area that was Stanford, and this was the area that we lived in, and it was in this area that we traded and our life was concerned. And this is where our synagogue was, and then up the street a little way we had a Jewish center. This was on Grey Rock Place, so not too large a building, but this was a place where the community got together, where there were weddings and bar mitzvahs and things of that type. But the biggest part of the life resolved on this synagogue. It is interesting to note that in those days, and people ask me questions why, in those days we used to have about 6 kosher butchers. Today, I don't want to say too much, but we have 1. We have an interest in that. And all the kosher butchers, of course, in those days, you killed your own chickens. And everybody had back of the store, they killed their chickens right in the same store. We had 2 shuftim in those days. One shuftim took care of the chickens, and the other took care of the animals, and then one, of course, davened for us for Shabbos and for holidays and for Shkedish and so forth. As a young fellow, I can remember very vividly Chazan Shapiro. I don't know if those of you remember him. He was a tall gentleman. He was a poet, quite a gentleman. The only thing about him, he liked to drink. And I remember Father we used to pick him up early in the morning, especially on a Friday when the days could be short. And first, before we met him, we would go to one of the delicatessens to get a couple of loaves of bread and some herring in the barrel, pick up the herring with puts around it. And of course, a bottle of schnapps. And with the shaykhid, and my father, and one man and myself, we would get in this truck and go up the country. And of course, the country in those days could be close to New Canaan or this side of New Canaan. And there, of course, my dad had bought an animal, a cow or a calf, and we looked for a tree. It had to be a sturdy tree. And when we got to the tree, we put the rope around the tree, bring the rope down, and then bring the animal, and then the chazan would slaughter the cow or the calf right there. And it was always interesting to me, especially on a Friday, when to make sure that the animal was kosher. See, you have to open up the inside. Chazan had to check everything, and we used to tremble for God if anything should happen. If that animal was treif, the community would have no meat to eat for Shabbos, and this was a really serious thing. People couldn't just eat chicken in those days; they had to have meat. And of course, then if the animal had some problems, we always carried a bicycle pump with us. And the reason the bicycle pump is you'd pump up the lung. The lung, see, the principles of kashrus, in a lot of ways, as far as meat is concerned, the Jewish religion is way ahead of the practices that we know and are common today in checking animals. Because in those days, tuberculosis was very prevalent in animals, and other diseases. According to the Jewish religion, the animal could not have tuberculosis or couldn't have any disease. But if he did have it, it would be along the lung. So we'd pump up the lung, and then the chazan would look at lesions to make sure there were not enough lesions there. to make it a TB animal. And this would be a terrible experience until finally the Chazan would say it's kosher. Once he said it was kosher, everything would stop. The bottle of whiskey would come out, the herring and the bread would be there, and everybody would sit down underneath a tree and eat and eat. And then, of course, we would process the animal and then put it on the truck, and it would go back to the butchers. But in addition to that, that's what we call native meat. That was not the best meat. Occasionally, once a week, we would bring meat in from New York. Now, most of the packing houses in those days in New York were located what you now known as the UN. Where the UN building is in New York today is where all of our slaughterhouses were. They were there and also downtown on the west side. Of course, they're not there anymore. And there never will be. And in order to bring that meat up to Stanford, it would come up here by water. We had very, very poor transportation. The roads were bad, and it was a long journey to go to New York. So the animal would be taken care of in New York, and it would be burlap. Burlap would be put on, and we'd put on a boat, and we would catch it down on the lower end of Canal Street. The boat would dock there Friday or whatever day, and then we would load it. Our trucks would be waiting there, or whatever, our horse wagon, whatever, and bring that meat into the butchers. And that's the way we handled that kind of meat for a great many years.
What year about it talking?
Well, I'm talking about a year of 15, 16, 20, 19, early 1900s. And of course, for refrigeration in those days, I'll always remember the iceman walking in, spent Friday afternoon, so the icebox would be iced up. He would come in with his big chunks of ice and throw it in the icebox, and that would chill the meat until it was used. It was a very primitive, as we think about it today, it was a very primitive way of doing things, of bringing in food into the community. But that's what it was, and that's the way we were used to it, and that was the method we used in those days. The community, of course, was growing, and changes were taking place. And I saw these changes I became president of the synagogue in 1952. I was probably the youngest president ever was served at that time. I came right after Mr. Joseph Weinkraut. Mr. Brenner knows that history just better than I do. I remember Mr. Brenner, I remember attending all these meetings with my father, and I always used to say to my father, you know, there's one gentleman there, and that's Mr. Brenner. He seems so much different than the rest of the people. He was quiet, reserved, and really dignified. And everybody else was hollering and commotion. I could never understand that. And of course, before that, we had a president by the name of Meyer Weiss, who was more of a gentleman. And when I became president, I worked with him very closely. As a matter of fact, he lived on Crystal Street, and I went to his home on a number of occasions for advice as to certain things that we ought to be doing in our congregation. And he showed me a picture. I don't know if those of you remember our old synagogue on Grove Street. This Grove Street synagogue was built in two parts, like Mrs. Brenner said of the Grey Rock place. Full of people, and there was a lot of things going on in the congregation, not with any really intent, but that were not right and that were not done in a proper manner. And we started making new rules, and of course, Rabbi Ironkrantz came into the picture, and together we worked very, very hard for a good many years. And today we can be extremely proud of the fact that we're probably one of the most flourishing congregations of the Orthodox type in this area. Matter of fact, I was in the synagogue this morning. We had a stranger come in from Queens, and he wanted to see our upstairs. I took him upstairs, and he said, you don't see many buildings of this type. But this has been all growth over the years. And the people that were there, the people I knew as a youngster, they're all gone. They're not there. The people that I used to see every Saturday and the people we used to see every day, of course, that generation is gone. It was a great generation of pioneers. They were hard workers, everybody had, we had a fine community, and as you came down the center of our town, all the main merchants in the center of the community were Jewish. The Frankels, the Siegelbaums, all and up and down the road, and Atlantic Street, and Park Road over here, and Main Street. These were all Jewish merchants, thriving Jewish merchants. We even had a bank, the Spelkes, the bank, the Jewish bankers. So we had a lot of growth in the community, and we were well accepted in the community. We began to become interested in politics, and a number of people came on various boards and commissions, and took a great part in the community. And so we've had growth. And we've had growth as we kept growing. And now, of course, not only do we have our own congregation, but and I have, over the years, the little I have done and participated with, I've always tried to concentrate on Jewish endeavors, because there are a lot of other people that can do the other things. And in as much as we are a minority, I kind of felt it was my duty to do whatever I could for our own people. And so we have today, we have Temple Bethel, we have Temple Sinai, we have Young Israel, a new congregation that's building on Oak Lawn Avenue, and we're opening up their building hopefully sometime next year. And we've had a lot of growth. And those of you that might be interested, after I was going on to tell you about the slaughtering that was done in the under the trees. Not too many years afterwards, we had our own slaughterhouse, which was located on Oak Lawn Avenue. Do you know where the juncture of Oak Lawn Avenue, as you make the turn on the left side, I think it's the third house down, was where our slaughterhouse was located for a great many years. Every once in a while, I turn, as I go to the synagogue, I go down Oak Lawn Avenue, and I make a left look down, and I remember the old big wheel where you used to pull up the animals and store them there, and this was a great delight to us. Finally, we had a place where we didn't have to go out to the country. We had some semblance of some degree of security, and also of other health arrangements. And so everything kept changing. Of course, today things are a lot different. There's no slaughtering that goes on today practically in any place in the East. There may be one or two small plants in New Jersey. This has all changed, and it always amuses me, even to today. A lot of people talk glot kosher. There is no such thing today as glot kosher. Everything that's slaughtered today is glot kosher. When animals are processed today on chain, and we are processing them at a rate of 250, 300 animals an hour, we have no way of opening up a lung and looking at it and checking it, make sure it's right. Our kosher people have instructions. It's either kosher or treif, and that's the end of it. You don't play with it. We don't have the time. You have 300 people sitting on a plant floor waiting, and you can't just stop the chain. So every animal, no matter where it's slaughtered today, under federal inspection, of course, and everything today is federal inspected, it's either kosher or treif. We don't take what we call a sikha anymore. We don't do that. That's all past the last 10, 12, 15 years or more, because of the high cost of operation and everything else. So I just want to assure you, I don't know, they make a big deal out of it, but we could never understand it. I think today, kashrus is more observed today than it has been a good many years past when I was a boy, because in those days, the loss of an animal meant a tremendous loss of livelihood. Today, the loss of one animal is very insignificant in the whole realm of the way we do business today. So it's either one or the other. There's no such halfway mark, and there's nobody checking it to be either way.
Who is it determined the animal's kosher?
With the shafter.
There's one in every plant?
Oh yeah, not one. You have to have 5.
I mean, the plant is approximately 300 an hour?
They'll have probably 5. The man that does the cutting, he is spelled out. He works for a half hour, and he takes a half hour off. That's a very tedious job. We have a humane way of doing it now. I mean, as humane as possible. And after the animal is cut, and it goes over the chain, then they start the process. One man opens, one man checks, the lungs, the livers, and every part of the animal is checked very thoroughly. And if it's kosher, the rabbi writes inside the fork order. And you can't change that. And if it's straight, he puts a cross. And that's the end of that. And there's no changing, and that's the way the only thing we have to be careful after that is every 72 hours the meat has to be washed. It has to be washed every 72 hours by a rabbi or a rabbi who authorizes a Jewish person who has a knowledge of meats. And that can be a very tough job. I've done a lot of that with our rabbis. Of course, for a number of years, Stanford did not have a rabbi. And unfortunately, we have to have meat koshered. So we employed a gentleman named Rabbi Rosenberg. I don't know if any of you remember Rabbi Rosenberg. He was a tall man with a dark beard, an extremely dedicated man. He later on, before he became president of the U in New York, but Rabbi Alexander Rosenberg, for a great many years before Rabbi Ehrenkrantz came into Stanford, represented us. And used to, of course, years back, we would bring in meat from the West in rail cars because the trucks were not as efficient as they are today. And if the car would be stuck 72 hours somewhere, we'd have to get to that car and open the car up and keep the meat kosher. And frequently, we'd do that up in New York State, Maybrook, New York. In the wintertime, you'd get in there and cold as could be, and you'd have a pump, you'd have these regular pumps with water, and you'd have to wash the fork waters. Just make sure that the fork water is completely covered with water. The rabbi would stand there and watch you, make sure that was done, and after it was done, it was kosher. Then there were 72 hours. You could repeat that process 2 or 3 times. Normally, you would only do it twice. Sometimes not, unless the meat was made kosher. If it was made kosher and salted and washed, then of course it's all set. The only meat we're not concerned about is liver. Liver does not have to be made kosher. Liver. The reason we do that, of course, we have to protect the meat for veins. Jews are not allowed to eat blood. You'll probably read that. And because we make sure that there's no blood in the meat that we eat, and this way it's made kosher and salted so that the blood comes out. But today, of course, the observance of kashrus is a little different than it used to be. Years ago, of course, I can remember Mother, this was a great thing. Of course, she bought meat and had to be kosher and had to be this and that, and chickens and everything, and we had shilas, you had questions, and we went to the rabbi, and what's wrong with this, or what's wrong with that. Today, I don't think Rabbi Ehrenkrantz gets a shilah once every 10 years. Of course, chickens are processed differently, the same as meats today. You have the large slaughterers all over the country today where poultry is grown and raised and processed. So we have that same situation that we used to have where they were done in the back of the chicken market. And for health reasons, of course, we've certainly seen a lot of progress. But getting back to this community of ours, the growth has been phenomenal. Those of us that have lived here and born here and raised here, it's hard to believe when you walk downtown and you remember this building there, and you remember that building, and you remember that institution, and it's all gone. And it's kind of it kind of makes you feel very sad, because these are the things that you grew up with, and these are the things that you were familiar with, and these are the things that you loved, and you kind of part of your life. And of course, as we unfortunately have seen a great many of our old people leave us. And you see you go into our congregation, especially ours, where I identify with it. You look around, and 99% of the people you don't know anymore. They're new, and the old timers are not there, and their seats are empty, and it's kind of sad, and you wonder. But of course, life goes on, and no one of us is going to be here forever, for sure. But to witness this kind of a change in such a relatively short time in human existence, it kind of shakes you up a little. But you always feel that it's for the better, and we certainly hope it's for the better. And we certainly hope and pray that that as we build these institutions, and that we will also look back at our history. And I think what you're doing here, trying to accomplish, is a wonderful thing. And I certainly would like to take some part in it because I think it's great. And there is a lot of history in this community. There's a lot of history. A lot of it, unfortunately, there was a lot of it with Mr. Chusky, not the senior member, but Mr. Sam Chusky, who used to come and pray, read the Torah for us Mondays and Thursdays. And, of course, and later on was in a Jewish home with his wife, passed away. He had a lot of stuff in his garage. He showed it to me. And I kept saying to Mr. Chomsky, this should be kept. It's very valuable stuff. Anyway, somebody took it. I don't know who took it. We never found out where it is today, and we don't know. And it's really too bad, because this would be very valuable material for this organization to have. I don't want to, one other thing I just want to say, and then I want to leave with you with, I can't fail to mention the Jewish home of Fairfield County. I think, in my mind, this probably is the best institution that the Jews have ever had in the communities. It's Fairfield County. I think it's probably one of the best. And you know, we have 240 beds, and we're now building the third edition, the final edition, which will give us 360 beds, probably one of the largest of its type. But those of you that have seen that institution, I urge you in every way possible. I think this, to my mind, exemplifies the best, the very best in care for the elderly, the very, very best, in every way, especially Jewish care. We observe every kashrus possible. We have 2 separate kitchens, a dairy and a meat kitchen, and we have activities that go on every day of the week except Shabbos. And it's something that any one of us that lives in Fairfield County, Jewish people in Fairfield County, can be extremely proud. If you have any friends, or if you want to show off what the Jews have accomplished in this area, in this community, you've got to go let them see our home in Fairfield. It's really something, and it's, when you go there, you're extremely proud. People go there not to die. We used to have a home that we were identified for a great many years in New Haven. Before we had our own home, we were identified with a home in New Haven for a great many years. And I can remember, I was on the committee, I can remember going there, and it was a very discouraging situation. When you walked in the building, you knew you were in some type of institution, and it was most depressing. And there was a handful of us that made up our mind that we were going to change that. As a matter of fact, for some years, there was I think the Ladies Auxiliary thought they were going to build a home here in Stamford. But thankfully, it's a very big project. I think I don't know, but I think it costs us, our budget, I think it runs around $12 to $14 million a year, and probably will be a lot higher. We began to realize it was just too big for one community, and that's why it was developed for Fairfield County. And incidentally, 30% of those that we have there now, 3% of the people in that home today are from Stamford. So we do have a great deal of interest in that home, not only from the point of view of financing the home, but we have a great deal of interest because there's a lot of our people are there. And those, they really do a great mitzvah for yourself and for the people that you're visiting, but it'll make you feel great because you've really seen a miracle. I consider that a miracle, considering what we have up there. And I know I got a letter just recently from somebody in Hartford that came down visiting our home in Fairfield, and they said, Mr. Lotstein, we have not seen anything like it. We're hoping in Hartford that we can someday have a facility of the same type that you have. So we can be very proud of that. But in closing, I want to thank you very much for asking me to come here. I hope I have said something that will be of interest and enlightening to you. And I want to also assure you that I think what you're doing is right. and I would like to help in any way that we can, because I think this is long overdue, because I think we'll find a lot of history and a lot of interest from this group here and others in the community once they get to know that we'll get the support, and I think it's worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Lou, I want to thank you very much. It amazes me that after having 4 or 5 people from the staff community all asked to talk about the same thing, you're able to come along and talk about the same thing and be so very different and keep people so captivated for such a long period of time. We have a few moments for questions, and I'll take mine first. Take my own question. Lou, I'm just curious. Here you, very successful businessman in the community, and you have Grand Central Markets, which apparently competes very successfully, I hope very successfully, with the finance and the AMPs. Did you ever have problems with the giants when you started your operation?
Yeah, we've had problems. We have problems with them every day, but that's nothing new in business. You expect problems.
You managed, and you prospered.
Yeah, we try. Yeah, of course, ours is a family business. There are 7 brothers, and we're all in the same business, and that's helped a lot, too.
It takes a long time to get a pendant roll every morning.
That's right.
Really?
I have 2 questions at the same time. One was the V.T. Harris Company Jewish? You answer that one. And the second one is, I've been around a while, and I've always identified the Brenner, Gainer Brenner, and his family living in Japan. And if he lived in Japan, why was he against your getting a zoning change for a Jewish cemetery on West Hill Road?
Well, he represented the family. He represented the neighbors in that West Hill Road. His firm did, Gainer.
Oh, I know what he was.
Yeah, he represented the families.
I see. And what about the first question?
The first question was what? I'm sorry.
V.T. Harris, were they Jewish?
Yes, but not practicing. The father, Benny Harris, was a Jewish man, rather active in the community. And the story goes, I never heard him, but the story goes that things got pretty bad there for a while, and he went out fishing and never came back. Now, what happened was, I don't know. It was deliberate or suicide. No, nobody's ever answered that.
I'm just curious to know, where did you do the slaughtering aid?
Well, all of our slaughtering today is done in Iowa. It's either Nebraska, Iowa, or Texas, but nothing in Chicago's even out. Years ago it was Chicago. Today it's Iowa.
My grandchildren in Iowa.
Yeah, incidentally, Hilda, I can remember wrestling with your late husband for a great many times, and I think about him a lot. He was a great guy. Yeah, great.
Is the kosher slaughtering done separately from general slaughtering, or is it all done in one place?
No, the cattle, veal, and lamb are all done in the same. Beef, veal, and lamb are all done in one plant. In other words, the same killing floors.
Yeah, but is it all kosher in one plant, and then for the general public, for the gentle in another place?
No, it's all the same.
Because I've been told that once something is passed, it really would be all kosher, whether it's so marked or not.
Oh no. In other words, the cattle hang. See, they hang in sides, and they could be hanging in a cooler. They'll be kosher cattle. The only differentiate that we know the difference between kosher outside of the forequarters, we tag everything. Every beef is tagged. In other words, every cut, the rib will have a tag, brisket will have a tag, the plate. I think there's 8 tags on a forequarter. Of course, the hindquarters are not kosher. You understand that? It's not kosher in the lamb. It's kosher in anything. It could be made kosher. I fooled around with that a few years ago. We were having trouble selling the lamb. And I said to Rabbi Rosenberg, why can't we sell legs of lamb? He said, you could, but you got to traber it. I said, let me be a traberer. They're called a knocker. And these people, we got this man from Israel. These people have a duty the same as a doctor. He has to know where every vein is. So he came into our plant, and we gave him the legs of lamb, and by the time he got through with take veins out of the leg of lamb, it wasn't worth saying. That was the end of that.
Wouldn't it be worth it on the beef?
No. There are too many veins. There are too many veins that you have to, and by the time you cut it up, there'd be nothing left. There'd be just...
They do it in Israel.
Sure, in Israel they do it, yeah. Of course, their costs are different.
I'm sorry, Bruce asked me.
Just some general information where your grandparents came from and their names and
possibly the experiences of anti-Semitism in the community that you might have experienced through the various generations.
Well, Ronald knows a little more about one of my grandparents, my father. He's got a history of my father. My mother came from Russia, and talking about anti-Semitism, you know, I never really experienced anti-Semitism to a degree where it really hurt me. I originally went to Columbia University, and then from Columbia I went to University of Wisconsin to study under Dr. Alexander Mickeljohn. I know if any of you knew, Dr. Mickeljohn was a very famous philosopher, and he was head of Amherst and Brown. And he wanted out to Wisconsin because Glenn Frank was president then, and he was considered a liberal. And he allowed him to put up his own college there, separate from the major university. And when I went out there, our dormitory where we were supposed to live was being built by the WPA. Anybody remember the WPA? And the WPA, when they did something, it took 20 years to do. So my building wasn't completed. So the girl that said to me, Mr. Lotstein, you're going to have to wait until your building is completed. Time, go into town. There's a lot of residences for students near the university, and you'll be all right. I said, all right. So I walked in town, and here I'd never been in Madison, Wisconsin. I was, I guess at that time, 20, 21. And it was getting a little dark, too, and I see this sign says students, residence for students. So I walked in this house, and I knocked on the door, and this woman comes out, and I told her I was a student, going to be freshman at the university, and I needed a room. She said, oh, yes. So she comes upstairs, and she shows me a room. I said, it's fine. I said, my bags are at the station, and I'll get them. We're walking down the stairway. She says to me, by the way, what is your religion? I said, Jewish. Oh, she said, I wouldn't rent to any Jew. And that was the very first experience that I had that was of that type. I never experienced it. Here I lived on Lafayette Street, more or less, and so I tell you, I walked around that town for a number of hours. Finally, I got one house. I was desperate. I walked in, and the woman says, well, she says, yeah, I have rooms. I said, but let me show you. I said, well, before you show to me, I want you to know that I'm Jewish. She said, what difference does that make? So I said, well, I told her the story. She said, that's the only person in the whole city of Madison of that type. And I lived with them for about 6 months, and oh, it was a great experience, but I'll never forget that one. But I tried to join Hubbard Heights Country Club. Before Hubbard Heights was a community, was run by, I won't tell you who, but anyway, I tried to join them. Right, that's right. And no Jews were allowed, so, yeah.
Pardon me, wasn't that the Brenner and Victor law firm?
Yeah,
Victor
yeah.
was his Jewish partner?
Yeah, Mel Dichter.
You really want to know what you
Brennan and Dichter, I was just saying to Lou that Dichter was Jewish and that was his partner.
Well, he was, yeah, I guess he was.
people understand.
In fact, I've had a letter recently from Mel Dichter in front of he's giving us some information.
Well, a wry remark, you know, the Jews are no good except as lawyers and doctors to you. That's the way an awful lot of them
How about the rest
view
of
the
us?
Jews. Well,
By
if you're not, they're questionable.
All right.
By the way, excuse me, in line with what Lou was talking about Madison, there's a building that's now a historic site there. In fact, I think it was on a postage stamp years ago. It was the Synagogue of Madison that was erected in 1863. So evidently Jews were there, quite a while. But you met up with a. That's right.
When we were really in our infancy a couple of years ago, there was a conference held in Baltimore of Jewish historical societies throughout the country. And your daughter-in-law, Marcia, was there, and we met her, and she was instrumental in giving us ideas to develop and how to set up our collection, or what to collect, and so on. So we really, through your daughter-in-law, have something else us get started. Another thing I wanted to say, how interesting your talk was. I'm on the Agudath Sholom Cemetery Development Committee, and there was still a break in that wall until it was passed out. And I was in charge of getting estimates from masons to repair the wall. So we said, why is this break in the wall? And no one seemed to know. He asked the rabbi said, it doesn't have to be, I don't know, some Louis Lotstein has something to do with it.
All right, last question. I'm sorry. How much more time you got? Whatever you want.
10, just a compliment.
to look.
I knew the Saskers very well, and I knew your family very well. And I remember Ralph and Saul saying that anything that you and your father said they would do, they did, and he was one of the most honorable men in Stanford, Jewish people. I thought I'd tell you about the Saskers. We're very fond of you.
If you're a member, you can ask a second question.
Just an observation, and correct me if I'm wrong. Lafayette Street was largely a Jewish colony on the east side of Stanford. And talking about anti-Semitism, I think you were pretty well buffered because you lived among Jews largely, if not exclusively. Growing up on Hawthorne Street, as we did, Chapel Street area, St. John's Place, I don't know whether the girls suffered it as much as the boys, but many a bloody nose and blackened eyes were received because you were inclined to fight back when you were called all kind of anti-Semitic names, which I don't have to refer to, but they were dreadful. And that was constant. It was constant here in early Stanford. Of course, sadly, in my own personal observation, anti-Semitism is not eradicated in Stanford or any other community. It is subtle. But in those days, it was overt. Oh, the battles which we used to get into because of this degradation and the names and actual physical violence, as I say, Hawthorne Street, St. John's Place, perhaps, Chapel Street area.
That certainly wasn't kosher.
That wasn't kosher.
Last question.
Lou, can you tell me the significance of some of the plaques in the wonderful stone wall of the Fish Church, the First Presbyterian, that have to do with the Jewish community 50 years ago, 75 years ago? Are you familiar with those?
I'm familiar, but I don't know too much about them, Doc.
Evidently, there's kind of a little bit of a special relationship between the Fish Church, which is actually called the First Presbyterian Church, and the Jewish community. It seems that I had a chance to speak with Donald Campbell before he retired. He said that when the first meeting of a Jewish congregation, much before Grey Rock Place, was actually in the old Fish Church, of course it was not called Fish then. And they had many meetings and finally started a congregation from the people that originally attended the basement of the First Presbyterian Church. On Broad Street, next to the library.
You're right.
No, right.
Last question, Arnold Walt, then a few moments of business.
I don't have a question. I've been in Stanford just about as long as Lou Lotstein. I don't know how old Lou is, but he's certainly just about my age, maybe a year or two older or younger, I don't know which. I think he's just skimmed the surface, and I, for one, would like to have him back to get into some more things about Stanford.
And he used to be quite often. Yeah, I can't tell you how impressed I was with Mr. Lotstein's friendliness, openness, liking of people, and the quiet charity that nobody would see, nobody would know about. I remember he always loved to talk to people, tell about his own experience. He would tell me about his first experience of coming to Stanford. How he and Mr. what's his name? Sustenance, they pulled their capital together to buy a horse and wagon to go out peddling, and how it really developed. I remember one particular incident I'll never forget. It was, at that time, the Agudath Sholom didn't give tickets for the holidays to the members. Members could come and buy them. The Jews were then $18 a year. But they had to come and buy their tickets for the high holidays. I was at the committee selling the tickets, and I had to be one evening. It was myself, was the late Joe H. Sherman. I don't think people knew him. And the wives, my old wives. One old woman came in to Mrs. Singer. She wanted to buy a ticket for the holidays. She says, how much are the tickets? She says, $8. She says, I only have $3. Well,
Joe H. Sherman says, either we give the tickets free or we get a full price. What can we do? Well, Mr. Lotstein says, all right. And I noticed Mr. Lotstein slipped his hand in his pocket. His hand came out with a $5 bill. He took the $3 from Mr. Singer and he handed to Sherman $8. And he noticed nobody else saw it. He noticed that I saw it. So he winked to me. Say it. He didn't want people to see that he came for $5. That was one of the instances I knew Mr. Lotstein. And I felt very bad when I heard that Mr. Lotstein passed away then. It was one of the, I think I wrote him a letter then. We mourn the loss of such a person that cannot be replaced.
Thank you very much, Morris.
Fortunately, the branches are the same as the tree.
Thank you. Lester Sharlock would like to tell us about something here.
I have a book here. It's Illustrated History of Stanford. It was recently published written by Estelle Feinstein and Joyce Pendry of the Stanford Historical Society. It does not encompass anything like we're trying to do with the Koenig report. It does not address any of the religious communities in Stanford. But it goes from the Puritans settling Stanford Revolution through the Urban Renewal and so forth. It was published in 2295, and I was able to acquire, I think, about 7 copies. And we're going to sell them for $12, and if anyone would like to buy a Hanukkah gift for someone, just pay George Goldberg, our treasurer. The full amount of the money is going to go into our treasury. So it's a donation as well.
By the way, there is some scanty information. There is some information on the Jewish community in there. There is. So I think it's of interest as well.
Well, what is the year that your family came to Stanford?
Yes.
I want to say something else about the founding of the Jewish synagogue. According to the little book written by David Cohn, it was about 1897 or 1895. The Jewish population consisted of a lot of single men peasants. Some of them left them once a year. They came here to make a little money. They could bring the families over. And about 1895, they used to go to Bridgeport for the high holidays. The Jewish gathering was a Mr. Bloom on the south end at a boarding house. And all the single people, peddlers or single men, used to come there, eat there, and get socialized. Then they decided it would be enough, we have enough people to have their own minion. So they decided they cleaned out the attic in Mr. Bloom's boarding house. They put in a couple of benches. They went to New York and rented a Sefer Torah and a box for Yom Kodesh and a little table for people. And they had services there. The only thing they would needed a husband. So they had one man there had a nice voice. He was very suitable to be a husband, but he couldn't read very well. So they decided they'll have two. They put another man alongside of him, and if whenever this man stumbled, they would read for him. And that's how the first Howard Yeshiva services were conducted in Mr. Bloom's attic.
Boarding house.
This is little that we dream. That is the foundation for the Jewish community in Stanford.
Thank you, Morris.
About a David Cohen. I've gone to various people. Now, my information goes back to the year of 1902, and I know that he was an ardent Zionist.
Yes.
He wrote things in Hebrew that you translated into English. And
he stumbled in 1885. There were very
few people there, most of them are single men who had left their parents in Europe. They were Catholics. I don't know, they used to send them from New York to Stanford. I don't know why. Going among the farmers. Go around with a pack and sell them whatever they needed.
All right. Well, I think we've learned an awful lot this morning, changing not only the presentation, the wonderful presentation by Mr. Lotstein, but also the interchange that you get from the various people who attend. I just made some notes. For example, a substantial number of Jews who arrived in Stanford stayed for only a few years and moved on, especially after 1900. Who were they? What was their impact, if any, on the community? We still know so little about the development of our own Jewish community, particularly because people were so busy scrambling for a living, trying to make ends meet, that they didn't take time to preserve. They didn't have time to preserve old records, and unless the family somehow or other kept it in the dresser drawer or whatever. So that many incidents of vital importance were never recorded for various reasons, but they are part and parcel of our being here today. For example, in line with what Lou Lotstein was speaking about anti-Semitism in Madison, when we had Irv LeBeau and Herman Olsweiler here, Herman was recounting some very interesting incidents that were never printed, of course, in the newspaper, in the local paper, about the severe problem he had, not only with anti-Semitism within the school system and recruiting for the local teams and so forth, but with the black community as well, so that these things that most of us aren't aware of because it was kept hush-hush, it's important. It's part of history. It's something we don't like to particularly talk about too often, but it's there. So it's the good things and the bad things. I think when you have to record, you want to record history and keep it as a vital part of how we develop. You have to be willing to incorporate all this, but it's something that we should be aware of at least. And there were things we came across all the time. Now we know, for example, that the first Jew who bought land here in Stanford was Moses Levy back in 1698. That Jacob Hart lived here for 32 years, between 1732 and 1764. We know a lot now that we never knew years ago. Who was Joseph Tobias, for example? We know he was the clerk of the borough of Stanford in 1847, what they call borough of Stanford. We don't know very little about him. We don't know who his parents were or anything. But I'm throwing out names only because I want you to realize and understand what we're trying to do, that there's little, we thought we knew so much, yet we know so little. And that's the wonderful part about a historical society, the reason for being. What is the reason for a Jewish historical society to preserve, to transmit this wonderful heritage we have? Because if we let it go, as Lou Lotstein mentioned, old-timers are, like all of us, we're all mortal. And we go, and the memories and experience will go with us. And unless we make effort to preserve all this, it's going to go. And those who come after us will feel that they don't have any roots. You look downtown Stanford, as Lou again mentioned, it's gone. I'm a newcomer. I came here in 1960. But since I've been here, even for me, last night we were coming down Main Street. We came from 95, and I came down that little portion, what's left, of Main Street, heading for the town mall garage. And it was really sad because there's nothing left except a telephone building and the URC office and maybe the Saks Corporation, the old suburban club. But beyond that, it's really gone. So I think that children growing up here today really don't have a feeling of roots as many of you, and even I who came later, were fortunate to experience in some way. So that's the reason for our having a Stanford Jewish Historical Society. But on the other hand, we have to be able to have facilities to expand, to be able to do the things we want to do. And right now, of course, we're fortunate in having the space that we do here, but the space is so minuscule, really, that, as I mentioned at the last meeting, to get 2.5 people into that room to do any work is almost a virtual impossibility. And so that's the reason why we have to look and urgently look for suitable quarters. I want to thank Lou Lotstein for being with us this morning. It was just a wonderful presentation. I want to thank all of you for coming. And Fine, we have them right here.